Good morning. My name is Eric Patterson, and I serve with the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. And we're privileged to partner with Open Doors International on this event and the launch of a documentation protocol. The Religious Freedom Institute is committed to achieving broad acceptance of religious liberty as a fundamental human right, as a source of individual and social flourishing, as the cornerstone of a successful society, and as a driver of national and international security. And so you can see how important to us protecting violations of this precious right is. The protocol being launched today will serve that goal by providing a robust articulation of religious freedom and how it's protected under international law. This will be a resource to support individuals and organizations facing religious freedom violations. It will help them advocate for protection of this right and pursue justice and accountability wherever possible. You'll hear more about this project later in the event, as well as hearing from individuals working on the front lines in this important effort. Now it's my privilege to turn the event over to Ms. Gloria Lucchesi, Senior Advocacy Officer for Open Doors International. She'll be emceeing today's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are today. And welcome to today's event. Today's event, gathering the evidence of persecution, the importance of documentation, also serves as the public launch of the International Protocol on Documenting Violations of Freedom of Religion. Now, as Eric said, the Documentation Protocol is a joint publication of Open Doors International and the Religious Freedom Institute, and it is the product of a range of contributors, including international lawyers, human rights investigators, religious freedom advocates, and diplomats. Now, before sharing more detail about the protocol, we are pleased and honored today to have two introductory keynote addresses. The first one will be delivered by Ms. Naomi Key-Kohler, an expert on conflict and mass atrocity prevention. Naomi is the director of the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And prior to this, she led the center's policy engagement with the U.S. government and work on populations at risk, including undertaking the museum's analysis of the crimes committed by ISIS in Iraq. And previously, she led the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect in New York's global policy and advocacy work, including its UN Security Council advocacy on crisis situations. Our second keynote speaker is Ms. Nadine Maenza. Nadine is an ardent advocate for religious freedom, and until a few weeks ago, she served as chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Ms. Maenza served as a USERV commissioner for 2 consecutive terms and represented the commission in several countries around the world to advance religious freedom. Following Ms. Key-Kohler and Ms. Maenza, we will also hear from 3 of the individuals who helped shape this project, the documentation protocol, and they will provide an introduction to the protocol. They will talk about its format and its purpose, and also next steps to support its distribution. And finally, we will hear from a panel of contributors who have been actively working to document religious freedom violations and bring that evidence to bear in efforts to secure justice and accountability in their own communities. Now, without further ado, it's my privilege to welcome Ms. Naomi Key-Kohler to open today's event. Naomi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gloria, and thank you to the Religious Freedom Institute and Open Doors International. It is an honor to join you today, and thank you for your critical work on the International Protocol on documenting violations of religious freedom. I wish that we did not need to be gathered here, but the reality is that almost 80 years after the end of the Holocaust, communities continue to be at risk of genocide and crimes against humanity, often targeted on the basis of their ethnic and religious identity. Identifying early warning signs, including looking specifically for violations of religious freedom, can be an important tool in helping to prevent these crimes. But as we know all too well, the international community is woefully failing when it comes to early warning and early action. Hence, documenting the violations is important not just for early warning purposes, but also along the spectrum of atrocity prevention efforts, including in advancing justice and accountability for crimes committed. At the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, this is something that we care deeply about, and we welcome the efforts to advance documentation and, critically, your efforts to support local communities in the pursuit of justice. At the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we seek to inspire citizens, leaders in the US and abroad, to confront hatred, prevent genocide, and promote human dignity through teaching and applying the lessons of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a state-sponsored, systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. Jews were the primary victims, 6 million were murdered. Roma, the handicapped, and Poles were also targeted for destruction or decimation for racial, ethnic, or national reasons. Millions more, including homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents, also suffered grievous oppression and death under Nazi tyranny. As an institution, we're committed to ensuring that the commitment of never again is not merely empty rhetoric. As one of the museum's founders, Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel said, "Let us remember, what hurts the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander." That is why we are gathered here today, to advance efforts to collect evidence, to motivate action, to advance justice and accountability, and in doing so to strengthen the community of conscience that we are all part of. We're here to advance understanding that first and foremost, these crimes are preventable. There are warning signs, notably signs pertaining to violations of religious freedom. No risk factor indicator on their own is sufficient, but when we see them, we need to take preventive action. The second is that early action in response to early warning can save lives. And the third, as Pari and Johanna will powerfully speak to, victims and survivors will not rest until there's justice and accountability for the crimes committed against their communities. Today's conversation will help to advance understanding of how and why crimes occur, identify the nexus between violations of religious freedom and risk factors of genocide and related crimes against humanity, and critically help strengthen the voice of those whose voices are too rarely heard here and in other world capitals. Local communities who are working hard to issue warnings, document crimes when they occur, and advance justice for their communities. In many cases, ethnic and religious minority communities are canaries in the coal mine. Restrictions on their rights, including crackdowns on religious practices, freedom of assembly, sharing one's culture with their children, discriminatory practices and persecution, and dehumanizing language can be warning signs of more ominous things to come. We know that genocide and large-scale crimes against humanity are rare, and that though discrimination and persecution do not always result in atrocities, their presence serves as a warning sign prompting us to act. To those who dismiss the importance of looking at these violations, it bears reminding that the Holocaust warns us that the unthinkable is possible and that everyone must act. When I did a little reflection prior to today's events, just on the work of the center, I thought that the titles of our recent reports since 2014 speak volumes to the importance of the protocols that are being discussed today and to putting an emphasis on following, tracking, and documenting violations of religious freedom and to heeding the warnings of those violations. In Iraq, our report that looked at the crimes being perpetrated at the time by the self-proclaimed Islamic State is called "Our Generation is Gone." That is what one Yazidi survivor said to us about what had occurred to their community. In the context of Burma and the targeting of the Rohingya community, our first report that looked at the warning signs of genocide, which was released in 2015, said they want us all to go away. Our second report, tragically after the violence in 2017, when the early warning signs had gone unheeded, is entitled "They Tried to Kill Us All." Our most recent report on the Uyghurs is called "To Make Us Slowly Go Away," because the Chinese government has been systematically targeting the Uyghurs on the basis of their identity. Simply the act of praying is sufficient for a Uyghur to be imprisoned, be them a child, a mother, a grandfather. Last week, we hosted a conversation about the risks of mass atrocities being perpetrated against religious minorities in Afghanistan, where poignantly a Hazara colleague outlined the existential threat to their survival, the targeting of mosques, maternity hospitals, the horrific, dangerous speech and rhetoric that's being espoused targeting them. In each of these instances, there have been clear, identifiable early warning signs that were present and went largely unheeded. Many of those early warning signs in their nascent stage started as violations of religious freedom. There are many times where we often feel as though invoking the importance of documenting and collecting evidence of religious violations of religious freedom is often seen as a boutique issue. And at times, the needs of vulnerable communities are sacrificed or downplayed in the interest of maintaining stability or power balances by larger communities. I think today's discussion is important recentering of the import of tracking all violations. It's critical that greater investment is made in documenting violations of religious freedom and dangerous speech targeting these communities. As I've noted, they're often the first warning signs of more dangerous things to come, and critically present an opportunity, if taken seriously, to avert and mitigate harm. One can look at the rights enshrined in various treaties, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to identify the types of harms, and as the protocol also does, to help identify what needs to be monitored. The UN Office of the Prevention of Genocide and USAID have frameworks that can be used to guide the documentation of violations and risks, as can the protocol. And there are a number of additional resources, including the museum's handbook for survivors called Pursuing Justice for Mass Atrocities, that go hand in hand with the important work and contribution that the protocols make in this effort. But critically, once we have documented these violations, once we have seen warning signs or crimes being committed, that information has to be shared and taken seriously by governments. And this, again, is where the protocol makes a very important contribution in articulating how one can go about collecting the evidence, what the violations are, and the urgency of the information that is imparted within them. It's critical that governments, first and foremost, state clearly that the prevention of mass atrocity crimes is a national security priority. The second is that there has to be dedicated repositories for this information. The United States is unique insofar as the fact that it has an International Religious Freedoms Office, which is vested with doing the type of work that is needed to help protect vulnerable communities. We need to see similar entities in other governments and multilateral institutions. We need to see senior officials appointed who are responsible for atrocity prevention and religious freedom, and who understand the nexus between these agendas, who can elevate the warning signs and act as catalysts within the government to urge preventive action, protective action, and also to advance justice. We need to ensure that those who are being deployed to countries where there are violations of religious freedom and risks of genocide and crimes against humanity are trained to look for the warning signs and are empowered to take action to help mitigate harm. This includes the ambassadors, the deputy chiefs of missions, and junior officers. We also need to urge governments to have their own early warning systems and include within that indicators of violations of religious freedoms, which the protocols will be useful to help inform. We know specifically from the Genocide Prevention Task Force, and I quote from it, "The first major element of a comprehensive system to prevent genocide and mass atrocities is a reliable process for assessing risk and generating early warning of potential atrocities. Effective early warning does not guarantee successful prevention, but if warning is absent, slow, inaccurate, or indistinguishable from the noise of regular reporting, failure is virtually guaranteed." And finally, we need to consistently work to integrate civil society, notably local civil society, into these efforts. When crimes occur, we all have a responsibility to outline to governments the preventive obligations for both crimes against humanity and genocide. Genocide, as many of you know, has a high legal threshold to be met if we're talking about criminal prosecutions. Just as important, though, are efforts to advance the promotion of crimes against humanity legislation and also an international treaty. We must work together to help educate policymakers on why this is so critically important and what the obligations are to prevent both crimes against humanity and genocide. We have a responsibility, and this is where the protocols again are so helpful, to support local communities to ensure that we are acting informed by their needs, concerns, and support for their efforts to advance justice and accountability, to guide and advise alongside local organizations, as organizations like the Free Yazidi Foundation and others have been doing, in accordance with international standards, to help build cases and identify pathways for legal proceedings. Justice may look different for different communities. In some cases, what may be just as important as criminal prosecutions is helping to preserve the historical record, identify missing and killed loved ones, advance reconciliation. It's really critical that we ensure that these efforts are not in tension with each other, and that the desires of affected communities are put at the fore of international efforts. The other speakers I know will go into more detail about areas where we all need to collectively be mindful, concerns around re-traumatization, over-documentation, how to work in a collaborative manner and ensure as well that we have the informed consent of those who are being interviewed in the process of collecting evidence and doing the important critical documentation work. I commend those who worked on advancing the protocols for putting those at the center of the efforts. Our institution serves as a warning. Today's discussion, the protocols, are an important contribution to ensuring that we heed the lessons of the past. The museum's founding chairman, Elie Wiesel, admonished us that a destruction that only man can provoke, only man can prevent. It is a privilege to work alongside all of you, remarkable advocates in the communities that are facing discrimination, religious persecution, and those working around the world to try to halt and stop them. I think today marks an important step forward in that effort, and I congratulate all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Keycolor, for your remarks, and thank you for your work on preventing mass atrocities and also keeping the memory alive on past ones, and for outlining today the importance of gathering evidence for violations. Now, let me leave the floor to Ms. Nadine Maenza. Ms. Maenza, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Open Doors and Religious Freedom Institute for including me in this important event, launching this groundbreaking report, International Protocol on Documenting Violations of Religious Freedom. And thank you, Naomi, for your presentation. It is hard to overstate the impact Naomi Keycolor's work has had on U.S. policy in acknowledging genocide in Iraq and Syria, China, Burma, and urging the U.S. government to take actions. I'm so honored to share the stage with her and the other excellent speakers that will follow. I recently met a man who had been released after years of being unjustly imprisoned because of his religious beliefs. He shared how his wife and children had left him while in prison, how he had lived in a destroyed home, had no income and no hope for a job. He sat across the table from me broken. Even now, fight back tears as I did not want him to think I pitied him because I had so much respect for him, yet you could feel the pain of all he had lost. This is the kind of suffering that is a result of religious freedom violations, the human cost. I just returned from Syria, where a Yazidi woman was just freed from a prison in Afrin, an area Turkey invaded and occupied in 2018 that previously had a culture of religious tolerance. She made the mistake of telling the Turkish-backed Islamist militias who now run Afrin that she was Yazidi to dispute the accusation that she was PKK, thinking it could save her from being detained. Instead, her treatment was actually worse, with a month of torture, including pulling off her fingernails and rapes and other torture so violent she now requires surgery. When Turkey invaded Afrin, the stories were so horrific that initially many of us found them hard to believe. Were they exaggerated? If they were true, why was there no media coverage or no real documentation? And there was so little credible documentation that it took a while for even people in our own community to understand the scale of the crimes, especially against Yazidis, Christians, and other religious and ethnic minorities. Fortunately, documentation did improve, and that has led to some of these Islamist militias even being sanctioned by the U.S. government for the kind of crimes that were committed against this Yazidi woman, and a UN report highlighting these crimes. We often talk about religious freedom violations in a way that sounds bureaucratic. And of course, there's a part of it that is bureaucratic, like religion laws that require revisions, etc. But there's also a real human cost, and this report directly addresses that. I have so much respect for the work of Open Doors and the Religious Freedom Institute because they are on the ground doing the real work. The authors of this report, like Jeremy Barker and Tiffany Behrens, show best practices for documenting religious freedom violations in a way that brings credibility to the reporting. They can also be used for advocacy and even in judicial proceedings, while also doing no harm in protecting the victims. I appreciate the focus on harm reduction in this report. There are so many violations of religious freedom that are hard to share publicly because of the negative impact it could have on the victims or their community. We need to be thoughtful in how we approach the information we are collecting. Even the stories I've just talked about were shared carefully in order to not harm the victims or their communities. Yet without guidance, one could think avoid documenting these crimes is the safest bet. Yet if we just walk away, these crimes will continue with no chance for change, accountability, or justice. This report covers this all very carefully, and I encourage you to read it and share it with those on the ground who could benefit from understanding how to proceed carefully and wisely in the most sensitive situations. I have focused much of my time on advocacy and education. While some of this has been public, like with media and on Twitter and other social media platforms, most has been private, focusing on officials in the U.S. administration, members of Congress, humanitarian organizations, and even officials from other governments. Having credible documentation is necessary, especially if the goal is to change policy, as that requires asking people to join you in pushing for internal change. Taking on the status quo is hard. I think of Amy Austin Holmes and others whose documentation has been critical in the work I have done pushing for policy changes. Without documentation, those doing advocacy would be powerless. Having the truth on our side is not enough unless we can prove it. And that is done through credible documentation. I am hopeful that this report, with steps guiding even the most inexperienced documenter, will educate those on the ground to collect information in a way that can be used to impact policy, change funding to be more effective, and even lead to justice for the victims. Let's face it, justice has been elusive for most victims of religious freedom violations. In considering the horrific crimes against the Yazidi community in Iraq and Syria, there have only been a few convictions, which means only a few victims have had justice. I'm thankful to Perry Ibrahim, Jacqueline Isaac, and others who continue to push for justice and accountability. This report will go far in providing a template on how to better collect information that can be used in judicial proceedings in the future. I can think of so many people I work with on the ground that will benefit from the detailed instructions. As was just shared, I recently finished my second term on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, serving last year as chair. On April 25th, we released our 2022 annual report, recommending that 15 countries be designated by the State Department as countries of particular concern, or CPCs, and 12 to be put on the special watch list. On the first line of each country report, we indicate if the country had made improvements in religious freedom conditions, if they deteriorated, or stayed the same. In 2021, only 4 countries showed improvements, and they were small improvements. 12 remained the same, and that many still were among the worst had the worst conditions in the world, and 11 showed a negative trajectory. How do we help improve conditions for religious communities and minorities around the world? There is no doubt that having real, credible information about conditions on the ground will go far in helping those educating U.S. policies and diplomats. As Naomi shared, it could also alert the world to mass atrocities in the future that no one is watching yet. It could influence the way humanitarian funding decisions are made, and it will assist those of us either creating advocacy campaigns or involved in private conversations with foreign governments to have accurate information so the advocacy is laser focused in making real change. I'm sure this will benefit USCIRF and their recommendations to the U.S. government, since they rely on civil society providing credible documentation. As Naomi said earlier, religious freedom is often a canary in the coal mine. All rights are interrelated. Standing for religious freedom is standing for all human rights. I'm thankful to Open Doors and the Religious Freedom Institute for this groundbreaking report, which I believe will become an important tool leading to increased credible information coming from the ground about religious freedom violations. I look forward to the following presentations from an impressive list of professionals with real experience. I'm sure there is much we can learn from them. Thanks again for including me in this important day.
Thank you, Ms. Mayanza, for your remarks and for especially focusing on the victims of violations and sharing such powerful stories from your own experience that really give voice to victims of religious freedom violations for which we are doing the work that we are doing. And this is really why we are here today, and the documentation protocol that my distinguished colleagues are going to talk about, to talk to you about in a moment, is also part of these efforts to advance religious freedom and provide an effective tool to provide remedies for victims of violations. So now let me introduce our next speakers who will be talking about the documentation protocol a bit more in detail. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Najib Bajali, Mr. Jeremy Barker, and Ms. Naomi Proudhot. Najib Bajali is a human rights consultant and previously the Middle East Advocacy Director for Open Doors International. Jeremy Barker serves as the Director of the Middle East Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute. And Najib and Jeremy were the 2 project leads for much of the development of this project. And let me also introduce Ms. Naomi Proudhot, who served as the editor for the International Protocol on Documenting Violations of Religious Freedom. And she is currently the lead lawyer of the investigation project of the Free Yazidi Foundation. Now let's begin with Najib to introduce the documentation protocol and talk a little bit about the vision behind it, its origin. Then Jeremy will follow suit and talk a bit more about the purpose of the protocol. And then Naomi will outline the structure of the documentation protocol. So Najib, the floor is yours.
And actually, I'll jump in. Najib was late, has another meeting, but should be joining us momentarily. But thank you, Gloria and Nadine and Naomi for opening the event with such powerful remarks that really helps to set the stage for what really was the motivation behind this report. As has already been mentioned, that oftentimes violations of religious freedom are right that's grounded in the human dignity of every person, every individual, and their rights, not just of identity, but also and belief, but also of practice. Oftentimes violations of that right, whether systematic or acute violations, serves as a warning sign for other types of atrocities. And yet in our work, we've often found that those who are bringing forward claims of violations of religious freedom oftentimes find the claims that they make dismissed either as anecdotal information or that the evidence being protected or presented is not to a standard that's sufficient for driving political and legal, even protective actions, and when those fail, for pursuit of accountability. And so at many levels, to move toward that requires evidence, it requires documentation. And that really is what we're aiming to do with this international protocol on documenting violations of religious freedom. It's aiming to provide a resource for the individuals, organizations who are on the ground doing that work, to provide them with the tools that they need, the best practices to carry forward. And then beyond a resource for them, it's also does a lot of work to help to link those violations of religious freedom to established international norms, legal codes, and others to show that the violations of religious persecution are not merely moral wrongs, but it's violations of rights protected in law and provides a basis for holding perpetrators to account. So those are some of the purposes that we aim to accomplish within this protocol. It's a privilege now to welcome a fantastic colleague in this effort, Naomi, who has shepherded a whole host of contributions from a wide range of stakeholders over the last number of years to bring this together. So Naomi, can you share with us a little bit more of the structure, format of the protocol and walk us through that?
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you very much for to Open Doors and the Religious Freedom Institute for such an important initiative and being behind the creation of the protocol. Thank you to all of you who are watching for attending this launch. It was a long time in the making, and it's very much a privilege to be able to present the protocol to you today. Now, to build on what Jeremy was saying, indeed, the objective of this protocol, by its creation, we sought to respond to the request of advocates who were committed to documenting the violations committed against their communities, but also specifically found themselves unable or unwilling to use domestic avenues for accountability and unfamiliar with what the international system offered and required, but also found themselves concerned about the well-being of their community members who were being pressed for information in a potentially harmful way. Now, based on this, our protocol had to respond to two demands: enabling access to the international system of accountability for human rights violations by presenting how to conduct documentation in a way that met best practices and general international standards, but also presenting a survivor-centered methodology to ensure that the rights of stakeholders and participants in documentation were respected and reduce any harm that could result from the documentation to the maximum extent possible. Now, as a result, we sought to structure the protocol for it to accompany the work of advocates from the preparation of documentation throughout the documentation process, and after finalizing documentation when seeking out avenues for advocacy and accountability. As you will see, the sections of the protocol correspond to these 3 stages. Part 1 presents the bodies of international law that apply to contexts in which violations of the freedom of religion and belief may occur, so that advocates can understand what elements of this freedom are protected under each framework and the different accountability avenues that they offer. Specifically, this includes protections under international human rights law for violations that occur in peacetime or armed conflict, international humanitarian law for times of armed conflict, and international criminal law for times of armed conflict or civil disturbance. This section also addresses other human rights connected to the freedom of religion and belief that may be at stake when the freedom is limited or violated, as well as specific groups that may be at high risk of facing violations to their freedom of religion and belief. Now, based on that legal foundation, Part 2 presents best practice and methodology to document rights violations in a way that can most closely meet the standards that international bodies have to accept and even consider information. It specifically provides instruction on how to collect different types of information that advocates may come across, such as physical information, documentary information, and testimonial information. Lastly, Part 3 of the protocol concludes with an overview of main advocacy and accountability avenues that are potentially available to advocates based on the context in which they conducted documentation, their geographical locations, and also their desired outcomes. Now, importantly, as was mentioned by my co-speakers, the protocol as a whole is based on an ethical and survivor-centered approach to conducting documentation, with 4 key principles highlighted throughout: harm reduction, to mitigate any potential harm that could result from the documentation as much as possible; informed consent, to ensure that stakeholders participate freely in documentation based on comprehensive and accessible explanations; confidentiality, to ensure that all aspects of documentation are kept safe and confidential, and carefully considering how information is shared; and managing participants' expectations by ensuring that they understand the purpose of the documentation, its potential outcomes, and their likelihood. So to conclude, as you can see from this, the protocol is very much part of an effort to ensure that documentation is within the reach of every advocate committed to documenting violations of individuals' or communities' freedom of religion and belief. We as a team were heartened to witness its usefulness in action as the protocol was piloted in northern Iraq. And I'm very, very heartened to leave the floor to my colleague Najib Bajali, who will be able to discuss the inception of the protocol in further detail.
Thank you, Naomi, and good to be with you all. So my name is Najib Bajali. I'm a human rights consultant. I previously worked for Open Doors for a number of years and was around when this idea for protocol was originated. So I'm just gonna give you for a few minutes a bit of a background just to tell you how this protocol came about. So I think primarily the need out of which the idea for this protocol was birthed was through engaging with local communities in both Iraq and Syria, whereby many people are experiencing violations of freedom of religion or belief, and many people on the ground were passionate about doing something about that. They wanted to be able to communicate what was happening, to be able to report it, to be able to use mechanisms locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally to be able to address some of these violations. protect themselves, protect their families, protect their communities, be able to enjoy their rights in the way that everyone else can around the world. But unfortunately, for many of these communities, they lack the capacity to do that. But they also lack a framework. There was nothing in a national framework that could have given them instruments or could have given them support in order to address or document or raise some of these concerns and some of these issues. So that was then communicated with a number of NGOs working on the ground. And the idea came to put together a manual, a set of standard, a set of best practices and tools that both explains what does the international human rights law tell us about the right to have a religion, the right to have a belief, the right to practice that, the right to change it, the right to, manifest it in different ways. So what does that all that mean in practice for these communities? How does it impact their lifestyle? How does it impact the way they are treated by the government? The way they're treated by their neighbors, by the way they're treated by extremist groups that have suddenly appeared to be in their surrounding. So understanding all these different complexity of the rights, making sure they themselves understand what does it mean to have a religion, to have a belief, or to have none for that matter. And also then understanding, as Naomi have just helped us to kind of see through, what are some of the practical ways that a simple people in their local communities can come together to put together some simple evidence that can actually help them communicate what's happening to them, help them showcase the violations that they've suffered, the troubles that they and their families and their community have gone through due to their right to have religion, belief, or none have been violated. So we kind of looked together at what exists internationally, and found while there were a number of protocols that looked in general on documenting human rights violations, there was nothing specific that addresses the right to freedom of religion or belief. And we thought that this could be a gap that we can work together as a two organization here, Open Doors and RFIs, to build something that put together some of the existing best practices from other protocols that are there, but also focuses on the specific area of religious freedom to really bring any kind of particular considerations that people need to understand as they raise their voice and speak up for themselves. I think that's ultimately where this protocol sit, is to help local people on the ground have the tools, have the instrument to speak up for themselves, to mobilize themselves in order to showcase their neighbors, their local communities, their local governments, but also the world and different international instruments, what they've been through, and be able to, one way or another, to claim their rights. So briefly, this is how this protocol come about, and I think this is something we can all celebrate, see something tangible that many people who are in a way unable to experience fully and enjoy fully their right to religion or belief can now rely on, hopefully, can use as something practical to raise their voice.
Exactly right. Well, it's been a privilege, Najib and Naomi, to work with you in bringing this project together over the last couple of years, and to see it piloted and tested. And so we'll share more at the end of this event of ways in which we're rolling this out, making it accessible to a number of organizations, a number of contexts. And now we'll turn it back over to Gloria to introduce our panel, which includes a number of partner organizations, including who have been on the front lines the last number of years in doing exactly what we hope the protocol will assist others to be able to do. So Najib, Naomi, thank you so much for your work in putting this together. And Gloria, back to you to introduce the last panel.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you so much, Najib, Naomi, Jeremy, for all your hard work to make this project come to life and for identifying a gap that needed to be bridged to ensure protection and redress for victims of religious freedom violations. But now for the next section of the event, we've asked 3 individuals who've been active on the front lines of documentation of religious freedom violations over the past 8 years, and particularly with regards to violence in Iraq and Syria, to really share from their experience in evidence collection and transferring that evidence into advocacy and the pursuit of justice and accountability measures. So we will first begin with Mr. Yohanna Tawaya. He's a director of the Humanitarian Nineveh Relief Organization, or HNRO, and he oversees the legal clinic that was one of the pilot projects of the documentation protocol. We will then hear from Ms. Pari Ibrahim, the executive director of the Free Yazidi Foundation, an organization that has been a leading charge for criminal prosecution for genocide crimes against the Yazidi community. And last but not least, Ms. Jacqueline Isaac, Vice President of Roads of Success, whose organization has helped to collect evidence of crimes and also to bring that to light in international fora such as the US, the UK, and the United Nations. So let's start first with Mr. Yohanna. The floor is yours. Thank you.
We work in documentation organization. We have a legal clinic which is working with that, and especially our work changing the pattern.
Yohanna, we're struggling to hear you well. I don't know if it's just me.
Yes, you hear me?
It's very quiet.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Yes, I can hear you really quiet, and the sound is very disturbed.
I have some problem in our mates.
Yes, it's a bit better now.
Yeah, it's best now.
Yes, let's try now. Thank you.
As my organization working in documentation, especially in the documentation of the crimes which were committed by ISIS, especially by ISIS and by Al-Qaeda before ISIS, before 2014. That is good now. My voice.
The sound is very faint. Shall we try and go to Pari first and then try again with Yohanna afterwards?
Okay.
Thank you. Apologies for the troubles. Pari,
Thank you very much. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So now it's been almost 8 years that the genocide against the Yazidi community in Iraq started. The Islamic State saw the Yazidi community as infidels, non-believers. They had to eradicate the Yazidi community from the earth. In the beginning of the genocide, I think a lot of the Yazidi community did not really think about like religious freedom, etc. But we always knew that our people were attacked because of who we are, our identity, our religion. And we knew that this was not the first genocide. This was the 74th genocide against our people. I myself, I have a background in law, so I knew exactly what to do and how to start. But a lot of the people that started to work with the Free Yazidi Foundation did not have that background. And so I'm really grateful to the Religious Freedom Institute, Open Doors, for creating a protocol like this that we can share with the people on the ground. It is very important that we also acknowledge the mistakes that were made in the beginning of documentation efforts. We have to understand the re-traumatization of survivors of religious freedom, survivors of discrimination, hatred, genocide, crimes against humanity, rape. So sexual violence was one of them, enslavement. And a lot of people did not know how to deal with that. And we saw it through the media, we saw it through documentation efforts that were done. But to talk about what our organization has been doing, we have tried to really do this work through a victim-centered approach, to make sure that we listen to the survivors, make sure that they understand the process of documentation. What does that entail? It does not mean that tomorrow immediately you'll get justice. We're talking about many, many years. Educating the people who are doing the work is really important to create success at the end of the road, down the road, 5 years later, 10 years later. This is not an effort of one day. Again, aside from that, I think it is also really important that we need to understand that advocacy and documentation starts with civil society. Again, these were Yazidis. Most of them had never heard of religious freedom, etc., because they were always oppressed. And now all of a sudden you start to document things, violations that happen to your community, and to make sure that eventually you do get justice and that things that happen today will not happen tomorrow again. And to be totally honest, looking at all the documentations that the Yazidis did, that the Free Yazidi Foundation has been doing for these many years, we did not see a lot of change that would prevent something that happened in August 2014, the genocide that happened then, wouldn't happen tomorrow again. And so we need to see some successes in the sense of justice and accountability. We need to make sure that in Iraq, in the Middle East, it is understood that you cannot get away with the crimes that you committed, and therefore documentation of certain crimes, advocacy from civil society is so important. I don't want to make it too long. Just want to say a couple of things about the root causes that create such things like genocide. We see in Iraq a lot of hatred against our community, and it starts with, for example, basic things like eating food that's made by Yazidi hands. A lot of the community members surrounding the Yazidis do not eat the food made by Yazidis, and that is specifically the reason that they think that Yazidis are devil worshippers, infidels, as many know. That's how the Yazidis are seen. This is very problematic. What has been done since the Yazidi genocide to prevent this hatred, to ensure that next generations understand coexistence of communities? By seeing these kind of problems, we are trying as an organization to make sure that we document, but also that we make change so that there is a better Iraq, a better Middle East where people respect each other. And again, understanding of documentation efforts and how to do it and how long things can take and what to expect is very important for civil society organizations, that they can relay back to the Yazidi community. One of the dangers I see is that civil society will fall apart if the advocacy voices and those who document all these crimes are not supported. A lot of countries are supporting with funding these big organizations, and civil society are scraping by to make sure that they can do the work they're doing. And the biggest effort comes from civil society. I see that with the documentation that the Free Yazidi Foundation has done, with other Yazidi organizations, what they have done. But I am telling you that there is a big concern that Yazidi civil society will not remain existing because there is not enough support to keep the work going. It is very dangerous. If we want to see a better Iraq, if we want to see that civil society is able to tackle the problems that exist in the Middle East, then organizations from civil society need to be supported to create that voice, to create that advocacy. I agree with the fellow speakers that we are going to make sure that this protocol is shared with, for example, our investigative team, who some of them are Yazidis who are trained to do documentation. So again, very important, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Pari. And Johanna, let's try again with you, and let's see if the sound is better now. You're currently muted. Okay. We unfortunately cannot hear you. It sounds like as if you're still muted. Yes, still very quiet.
For as I am
The sound is unfortunately the same as earlier. I'm so sorry.
Hello, Gloria.
Yes,
Gloria.
this is better. This is better. But let's try.
It's fine, good. We tried to document many cases last year, especially after make a training in the protocol, and that we found it very interesting because we followed all the steps of the protocol. That was very useful for our team. For that, all the documentation which we did in all the cases, it was very different from before. For that, now we have many problems in religious freedom, especially in Iraq, because of we have many legislation which are against religious freedom. We are working on that. We have many cases. We work in two sides, with the government and also with the society. Also with the courts in that. We found violation from the Iraqi government against religious minorities, especially in the Article 26 of the ID card, which forces the minors with the father or the mother or the Islam, and that it is a real problem in Iraq for the religious minorities. We tried to document these cases. We had many cases, but after asking the victims to make the documentation as the creators of the protocol, or that they accept to do that with us. For that, document 3 cases last year from Christians who are forced to be Muslim and can't return their religion. And that is a violation of religious freedom. Also, we documented some cases of ISIS crime, and in that issue we cooperate with UNITAD and
Johanna, I'm so
You
sorry.
yes.
I tried to
Hear me?
wait to see if it would get better, but we are still struggling to hear you. Unfortunately, I'm very sorry.
I think that is because of the heat. Perhaps.
Sorry?
Because it is very hot in Iraq. Perhaps. The net is very bad.
Yes, I'm really sorry. Jacqueline, shall we go to you first and then maybe try again for the last time? Johanna, I'm so sorry. We're all looking forward to hearing your remarks, of course. Hopefully later it will work. Jacqueline, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here today. Thank you to RFI and to Open Doors for creating this outstanding and very much needed protocol. I remember Jeremy and I about a year ago now. Can you hear me well, by the way? Okay. I remember Jeremy and I about a year ago now were speaking about the gaps and the frustrations among the Christian community in Syria for the lack of documentation of the crimes committed against them. And then on the other hand, we go into Iraq and we hear the stories of over documentation and the traumatization that has been caused. And we hear it today from Pari, and I think it was so eloquently spoken about. The people don't know. When they are in war, when they are traumatized, when they are going through what they've gone through, they come out of a war completely burnt out and unable to even begin thinking about the options of justice. And when I began 2011 with the Syrian war, and when our teams went onto the ground in Syria, we saw the chaos and the confusion that war brings naturally. And we saw that many didn't understand what justice could look like. And so over the years, we realized that many wanted to tell their story. But when you ask them why, and I think this is a very important question for civil society, they need to understand why they're telling their story. They need to understand what it is. What is their story going to do when they tell it to the world? What is it going to do for them? How is it going to benefit them as individuals? And how it's going to benefit their communities? In 2014, we went to Iraq. We stood in the war front lines. We went to Sinjar Mountain. On the next trip, we met many survivors, Yazidi survivors, girls who were kidnapped, who were put into captivity by ISIS, who were sexually violated, raped, forced into marriages, and their lives were destroyed. And when they came out of captivity, we were asked to meet a group of girls, beautiful, beautiful, innocent, brave, wonderful girls. And when we sat at the park and we started to speak, I remembered that, yes, I'm an advocate, but I'm also a lawyer. And I had to really understand on a macro level that before they said their story, they needed to know their options. They needed to know why they were telling their story, if they should or not tell their story, what different forms of justice could look like. Because one could look like advocacy for one survivor, and another would be accountability where they get to stand in front of their perpetrator. And at that park, when we met these young girls in 2015, early 2015, on our second visit, I saw that they had pains and they had dreams. And as members of civil society, as humanitarian organizations, as lawyers, we hold a responsibility when we meet these survivors on the ground to see what their desires are, how to protect them, not to harm them, and to make the dreams that they individually want come true in the best way we can. And at that park, I met two girls. I'm going to share their stories. One of them, her name was Ikhlas. Ikhlas was a brave survivor. She had just escaped ISIS captivity. And when she came out, she had many, many dreams. And one of her dreams was to save her sisters out of captivity. And she said, I want to speak in front of the entire world. I want to tell them, I want to let them know that we have a desire, because we came out of captivity and we're burning with this desire, with this need to go out there and save our sisters. So if we can't physically do it, if we can't go back into those dangerous areas, we want the world to know our stories, to save our sisters, to save the other Yazidi survivors. Now, in her heart, in her mind, she believed that the entire world, if the entire world heard that this can be done, that helicopters could be sent out and armies could be dispatched and they would be able to save the girls. As a lawyer, I had a responsibility to explain to her that if she told any part of her story or those needs, what the possibilities were. One is the world would hear, but what they would do depended on how they could respond. She ended up becoming a very strong advocate for not just the Yazidi community, but for Christians and for other religious minorities and for those that were in captivity and have had sexual violence committed against them. We took a short video of her where she said, I'd rather die than live if I don't save my sisters. And she raises her hand and she says, I will do what I can to tell my story for the world, to hear and to help. We took that video to the United States Congress, where I testified in 2015. In 2016, a congressional resolution was passed. It was a concurrent resolution. And it said, expressing the sense of Congress that the atrocities perpetrated by ISIL against religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq and Syria include war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It mentioned the various religious minorities, including Christian, Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriac, Armenian, and Melekite, Yazidi, Turkmen, Shabak, Sabian, Medians, Kankai, and among others. That was the beginning, though. If you take a look at the language, it says expressing the sense of Congress. 1 year later, we went to the UK Parliament where we brought ikhlas and we spoke the day before the House of Commons was also going to make a determination on a genocide resolution. The night before, as advocates, we spoke. We shared the stories not only of what happened to Yazidis in Iraq, but also my mother, who is the founder of the organization, had just come from Syria, where she was able to take stories of mothers whose children were crucified because of targeting, just due to their faith. She took those stories and she shared it as well with members of the House of Commons. The next day, 278 ayes, 0 said no. And what was the declaration? That this House believes that Christians, Yazidis, and other ethnic and religious minorities in Iraq and Syria are suffering at the hands of Daesh, and calls on the government to do something, to make an immediate referral to the UN Security Council. Again, look at the language. It says that this House believes. Why do I mention that in both the US Congress scenario and the House of Commons? It is because advocacy works to bring governments to action, but it is only the first step. And as the Honorable Nadine Manza said it so eloquently, without documentation, advocacy would be powerless. So as an advocate and a lawyer, looking back from 2011, where the team went into Syria, 2014, when we were in Iraq and sat with Ikhlas and asked her, what would you like? What are your dreams? Seeing what was happening with members of parliamentarians and congressional advocates all over, we saw that advocacy mattered, but it's only the first step. Now, going back to that park, that second story was a story of a girl named Ashwaq. When I asked her, what do you want? What is your dream? She said, I want to stand and face my perpetrator in court. Years later, she did. She kept her story. She did proper documentation. She did not advocate all over the media. and tell her story several times, because if you do, it can compromise the testimony. And she stood in front of her perpetrator in Iraq, and she told her story, and she got accountability and justice that was meaningful to her. So I'm so thankful for this protocol. I'm so thankful that now members of civil society can go out there and understand that there are options of justice and they look different for each survivor. And to know that we now have the tools to really see justice and practicality. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak. And I look forward to see what we can do together in the future.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for your remarks. Very, very powerful and very powerful stories as well. Johanna, shall we try a third time and see if the sound works now? I cannot hear you.
Maybe Johanna try to speak into the microphone if you can identify where the microphone is, because the sound of your voice comes in and out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I try.
No, feel.
Now you hear me?
I can hear you, but the sound is very disturbed. Let's try to speak a little bit more. I'm so sorry, Johanna. Perhaps, Jeremy, it might be possible to share Johanna's contribution by email to all the attendees. I'll take it as a, okay, he said yes. Well, my apologies, Johanna, but we will share your contribution to all the attendees to make sure that everyone is able to read and hear from you as well. Thank you for all of you for the work that you do on the front lines for documenting religious freedom violations and taking care of the victims. And we have a little bit more time, so let's ask a couple of questions, follow-up questions to your remarks. Unfortunately, I'll address them only to Jacqueline and Pari because it seems that the sound doesn't work for Johanna. The first question is from me. I would love to hear a bit more from you of what are some of the challenges that you faced when documenting religious freedom violations, and for example, in piloting the protocol as well, as there's some organizations here maybe attending and listening in who might be interested in implementing the protocol themselves in other regions. So maybe hearing a bit more about the challenges and what has been done with it might be useful for them.
I think I can take this question. So the Free Yazidi Foundation has now many years of experience. One of the things that we see when documenting certain violations, people don't really have an understanding that within genocide, there's a lot of more crimes that were also committed by the Islamic State, as I mentioned before, like rape, slave trade. One of them, slave trade, is one of them that's very important to not forget. This was the intent of the Islamic State to destroy the Yazidi community by kidnapping the youth and women, and to ensure that the Yazidi women would not be able to have children of the Yazidi community, but make so-called cups of the Islam for the Islamic States. So it is very important to understand that the slave trade was also one of the crimes that was committed against the Yazidis. I want to just make very clear that in Iraq, we did not see certain cases were brought forward, but I cannot say that there was justice for the Yazidi community. Specific cases that have been mentioned here in this conversation, it is not, when it's a charge of terrorism, it is not justice for the Yazidi community. The crimes that were committed against Yazidi survivors are much more than just terrorism. Terrorism is an easy charge. So the majority of countries, prosecutors, they go for terrorism because it's easier to show that someone was part of the Islamic State. But we do not talk at all about the rapes, the murders, the enslavement of Yazidi women, very well knowing in Iraq that the perpetrator bought and sold a Yazidi slave, very well knowing that he raped her, and still no charges related to those crimes. This is very problematic because we as the Yazidi community, with all these documentation efforts, we want to show that was more than just terrorism, that Islamic State was just more than a terrorist organization. It was a genocidal organization committing genocide, trying to eradicate people from the earth.
And Pari, I would love to add to that, as you shared about this issue, the Christian Persecution Review, which happened in 2019 in the UK, was a review of what the UK could do to stand with, in this case, it was Christians, but it also reflected other religious minorities. And I just want to read to you one of the recommendations that ended up coming out was 21B. It says the FCO will champion the prosecution of IS perpetrators of sex crimes against Yazidi and Christian women, not only as terrorists. So, as you said, Pari, this is a major issue that there's been a lot of prosecutions, and you see the word terrorism, but there was much more, and that evidence is required for a later establishment of war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, especially for these particular communities that were targeted, as we've seen, like the Yazidi community. I also want to add to this an issue that Christian survivors are facing in Iraq and in Syria. There have been many survivors of sexual violence in the conflict. And one of the Christian survivors who was anonymous made a statement actually at the Christian Persecution Review. And when she was speaking, she said that in contrast to much that she had seen via the media, in Iraq for various minorities, she said the Christian women that escaped are silenced. After thinking that we had escaped captivity to find freedom, we found ourselves in a new prison behind virtual bars, hidden away from the world. We are alone because the world is blind to our stories. Please bring our stories to light. I'm mentioning this because survivors in that community came out hoping that they could find justice, that they could get their stories documented. But what they found is that religious leaders within their own community did not want them to speak up. The members of their community were afraid for them to speak up, and they wanted an outlet. They wanted to find a way towards justice. And at the end, there were several survivors that were able to get their stories documented for legal purposes so that later they can possibly have their day in court. But one of the struggles they faced was fear. It was a fear that if they told their story, there would be serious ramifications. And this goes to that no harm principle. When you're working with survivors, one of the questions you need to ask is, will there be harm here? And how can we help? How can we help decrease that harm? And one of the ways we found that we could help in this situation was that we saw the role of religious leaders to help either support justice or vice versa, that they could actually hinder justice. And so a couple years back, we ended up creating a document called the Declaration of Humanity for leaders of faith and belief. And what we did is we brought religious leaders from all over the world to sign on to a document. I'll be happy to send this over, that said, we know that we have a role. We know that we have an influence in our community, and we will do what we can to use our platforms to dismantle harmful interpretations upon many other things, but just the words, to dismantle any harmful interpretations of our own religious texts. There's language here that says, we don't want any misconceptions. As religious leaders, we are standing with survivors, and we saw that with the late Baba Sheikh, the way he stood for survivors, the way he changed the narrative for that Yazidi community. It was outstanding, and it allowed them to come out, to tell their stories, and to properly document it. We also saw a gap in Syria with Christians. The situation in Syria was a political situation where they didn't know who to trust to be able to document their stories for justice purposes. And we found out later on that it wasn't just the stories of what happened by ISIS, but the more they told their stories, the more we were able to properly document, we were able to identify who those perpetrators were. So what I want to say is there are gaps. There are many gaps. Some of those gaps are legal gaps, others are political gaps, but others are cultural and religious gaps that we need to address as an international community, because it's really a holistic approach. When you think of justice, you need to think of the holistic approach that will benefit the survivor overall. We need to make sure that she's going to be safe. We need to make sure that she can reintegrate, in fact, into her community. We need to make sure that she has all the resources, or he has all the resources, to be able to stand and really fulfill his or her dream and to meet their own potential. So it's not just with one lens. As civil society, we need to look at the holistic approach of what justice truly looks like. We were just at a conference in the UK a couple weeks ago, and at that conference, the Murad Code was mentioned several times, very similar to this idea of the protocol, which says, how do you approach a survivor? How do you make sure that they're not re-traumatized? How do you make sure that there's not over documentation? And really give justice in the way that the survivor sees fit. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and thank you for outlining the importance of adopting a very comprehensive approach when addressing religious freedom violations, and also for highlighting the importance of having a survivor-centered approach. And thank you to Pari as well. She unfortunately had to leave us for another meeting, but we are coming to a close to our event. And before we do that, we actually want to share some additional next steps for how you can learn more about the protocol and how it can be put into practice by other organizations working to monitor and document religious freedom violations. So, Jeremy, on to you to share more about it.
Very good. Well, thank you so much to Jacqueline and to Perry, and also to Johanna for sharing from their experiences that really encapture so much of the challenges and also the value of this. As I think we heard examples of ways in which documentation and advocacy has been successful. It's driven conversation and actions, and we hope that this becomes a tool to support individuals and organizations in that work. So the protocol that we've been talking about today is publicly available now on the Religious Freedom Institute website. You can see more about that. It's available currently in English. We'll have an Arabic and French translations available very shortly as well, to help assist in orientation to the protocol and for organizations who are interested to put this into practice. We've been looking at various ways to help support in that effort. For some of our initial pilot work, it was more than 6 sessions of training and orientation, working with both lawyers, with civil society activists, and others to understand the protocol. And that's certainly something that our team is willing and able to look at, where the opportunities are there to come alongside in those cases. But for others, one of the things we have available is a 60-minute orientation session. And so that's something that you can request to help orient you to the specific details of the protocol and ways that this may fit into existing efforts or the needs of your organization or community. So to find out more about that, it's on the Religious Freedom Institute website at religiousfreedominstitute.org/protocol. And that's available there. And we really hope that this serves as a resource for organizations who are on the front lines of documentation work. Additionally, it's a resource for diplomats, for those working in multilateral organizations or in advocacy, to help in navigating the various legal codes that exist in international criminal law, international human rights law, and ways in which the rights to freedom of religion are protected within those laws. And so that's another area of usefulness that we see for this protocol. So those are there. We hope that today is the first of many conversations and providing additional resources and capacity to those types of organizations like that of HNRO or Free Yazidi Foundation or Roads of Success and many others. So again, from the Religious Freedom Institute, from our colleagues on this project, for Najib and Naomi, a true privilege to partner with you in this. And Gloria, we'll turn it over to you once more to conclude today's session.
Thank you, Jeremy. And yes, we've come to the end of our event today. So I want to thank you, all of our distinguished speakers who outlined the importance of documenting religious freedom violations and going through the documentation protocol project and its use in the field. And a special thanks, of course, to our keynote speakers, Ms. Kikoler and Ms. Maenza, for joining us here today. And thanks to everyone who took the time to attend to this event. It is really our hope that this project will be used to benefit victims of religious freedom violations around the world. Thank you all and goodbye.